O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Amen.
Amen.
So, well, there's one passage left on St Iakov Netsvetov that I wanted to read, and that was from his diary on his visit to the Athabascans, which I think is, really, quite fascinating. Here he's an old man, and the amount of physical exertion it would take to do all of this. So let me pull up Google Maps. Okay. And go to okay. All right. So, Russian mission in Alaska is such a thriving metropolis. It doesn't even have a picture. Okay, this is the Yukon River, which continues on up in and goes all the way into Canada. And unfortunately, in the text, they're using all sorts of native names of places, most of which have changed. So this starts, this is the it's in 1853 in May. Today, the Chagliok Toyan Alexander Kantelnuk arrived here in a Badara. He is traveling to the Andreevskaya Одиночка on his own business. He asked when I intend to come to him this season or to travel along the Chagliok River in order to reach the Kolchani, who inhabit the upper reaches of the river. I think the Chagliok is the Yukon, and the Kolchani are Athabascans. The Athabascans were comprised of many tribes and many bands. And were awaiting me in the settlement of the Toyan Kantelnuk. A number of them have visited here in the previous year, in the last days of May, and have accepted baptism. As this season, the inhabitants are making use of the early clearing of the Kvikpak River, I decided to travel thither on the 15th. Then I made my decision known to him, Chief Kantelnuk, and asked if I might proceed without him and count on locally available aid for travel to the settlements along the upper Chagliok. And he said, I can count on his son traveling with me to the Kolchani territory. I shall have need of him as a second language interpreter. He helped me proceed thither, saying further that the local inhabitants, in all probability, will assemble in one settlement or another to await my arrival, which I have promised the same visitors from there to do last year. After our conversation this same evening, he went on downstream toward his destination. I commenced preparations for departure. Now, the Yukon River is huge. So you can see here's an airstrip. The river is the river is wider than the airstrip is long. To give a little bit of, oh, wait a second here. So can you see down here, there's it says 5,000 feet.
Right.
Okay, so that looks to be about 5,000 feet. That's a big river. So just a reminder, Toyan means, it's kind of like a chief or a headman. So May 14th, the workmen continued the usual task of construction. I completed today all preparations for departure, taking along among the clerics the subdeacon K. Lucan and my nephew Vasya. I am leaving the sacristan Goltzin at the church here. All the workmen remained here in charge of Creole Belkov. Only the adolescent Silatir, which who knows what that means, Zakharov is coming with me. The rest of my companions are local natives. May 15th. Having prayed to the Lord God, asking for his aid and blessing, we left Ikogmiuk about noon, traveling in 2 3-hatch badarkas. In other words, it's a kayak with 3 places, going upstream along the Kvikpak River. I was accompanied by the Ikogmiut Zakazchik. Ikogmiut is a town. Zakazchik would be, I don't know. Anybody have any ideas what a Zakazchik is?
It's not the shaman, right? It's not the witch doctor or whatever.
No. A Zakazchik it's a Russian term.
Vladika, Zakazchik means someone who placed an order, whatever that means in this context. Basically, someone who ordered something.
Yeah. Well, in this context, what would that mean? Anyway.
Commissary, maybe.
Unless he was one who had been ordered to go, or who had been requested or ordered to go. Anyway, I was accompanied by the Ikogmiut Zakazchik Pavel Kintelnuk, who traveled in his own 3-hitch badarka, and by natives in their own badara. Thus, our party consisted of 4 oar-propelled vessels. The only obstacle of no great significance was the driftwood and debris carried by the current which we encountered in the stream. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we passed the settlement, Ikalavagmut, where there were but a few people on hand. Going on a not very great distance, I stopped for the night at an uninhabited place. So, he's rowing for 4 hours upstream, and they stop and make camp. May 16th, we went on at 5 o'clock in the morning and continued traveling throughout the day, meeting nothing and no one, just the driftwood and debris. By evening, having reached the summer location belonging to the Pamut village, we stopped for the night. There were residents there. So, if you can imagine, just going in a canoe up this huge river, that's half a mile wide, and this is like 2 miles. This would probably be over a mile wide. hard to imagine. Okay. On May 17th, in the morning at 6 o'clock, we went on and continued traveling throughout the day. About noon, we entered the channel of the Chagliuk River, Shagaluk Slough, that is, traveled through the islands at the mouth of the said river. In the evening, we entered the real Chagliuk, where, beginning at the river's mouth, I began meeting the nomadizing residents of the village, Anuluktakpak, who had begun the spring fish catch of the fish sigi, that is, whitefish. I stopped for the night. When I reached the summer camp of their Toyan Konstantin Napugak, I received from him various necessary intelligence about their well-being and so on. May 18th, I went on at 7 o'clock traveling along the river Chagliuk. The above mentioned Toyan left with me as he wanted to accompany me and should the need arise, be of help. We continued traveling throughout the entire day, and about 5 o'clock, going on evening, came to the place of residence of the Toyan of Chagliuk, Alexander Kontelnuk. Here we stopped for the night. As stated earlier, the Toyan himself was not in residence. His son, Nikolai Kniktayulu, is here with 2 families. The rest of the people are all in dispersal along the river. May 19th, I set out at 6 o'clock in the morning. On my invitation, the said Toyan's son Nikolai accompanied me. I need him as a second language interpreter for communication with Ingalit and with the Kolchani. My interpreter, Subdeacon Lucan, does not know this language. We continued to travel throughout the day without stopping, meeting up at various places the local inhabitants who are nomadizing and who are busy with fishing. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I arrived at the permanent Chagliuk settlement. Here I met 3 Kolchani men who traveled hither from upstream and were awaiting my arrival to notify their compatriots. Immediately upon my arrival, 2 of them set out up the river and the 3rd stayed. Though it was my intent to travel through all the Kolchani settlements, I have learned that on their own initiative, the Kolchani gathered in the lowest village, Kolya Chagmiut, in order to come to the settlement upon my arrival here. Thus, I settled down to await them. In the meantime, I was busy with those who were newly converting, whom I met in the course of my first visit here in the year 1851, but who remained unbaptized because they went off in dispersal on hunting and fishing. In the morning, I preached the word of God, and then, according to their faith and expressed desire, I performed over them the christening, a total of 15 persons, 9 men, 6 women. Among those who became christened was the Kolchani, who stayed behind yesterday. Besides these, I christened an infant born in the past year to Christians. Then I waited for the arrival from upstream. They came by evening in birch bark boats, canoes, in bati, which are large wooden canoes, and one by dara. I counted up 100 of such canoes and boats as they came all together at once, so that the river Chagliuk was covered with, in its entire width with the canoes and boats. After the Kolchani had arrived, the Starshina, the elder, of the Nagastilligmiut settlement, Ivan Nikonitsagi, who became christened at Ikogmiut last year, came to me with a visit and declared that all the Kolchani from the lowest villages have come, and also part of those living along the river Tlachina, together with their families, and that they have been joined by a number of Ingalit from the river Kvikpak, who reside near Nulato in various localities. Also accompanied by their families who came to them at this time they were leaving hither via the channels, that is the slough, and who are called Sayaki. I questioned the Starshin about whatever was necessary and left the rest for tomorrow. May 21st. Beginning in the morning upon my invitation, all the Kolchani and the Ingalik from the Kvikpak and the local ones gathered at my place, and I preached the word of God Continuing beyond the noon hour, everyone listened to the preaching with attention and apparent interest, without the least statement to the contrary or argument, and in the end they all expressed faith without doubt and the wish to accept holy baptism, both the Kolchani and the Ingalit. I made a census by families and kin groups, and then in the afternoon began the act of baptism. First of all, I baptized 50 adult persons of the male sex, Kolchani and Ingalit, the latter from Kvikpak and Chagliuk. This act was finished already when it was evening. May 22nd. I began the act of baptism in the morning and prior to noon baptized 72 persons, adults of the female sex. In the afternoon, I baptized the older children of those who were newly christened, 54 persons. The act was finished by evening. A total of 126 persons were baptized today, 33 of the male, 93 of the female sex. From this activity, I became dreadfully tired and by evening felt pains from prolonged standing. However, the days at this season are clear and hot, and this is very tiring. However, the spiritual joy at the sight of so many souls joined to the flock of the Christian church made up for everything, and the bodily weaknesses became much unfelt. And when in the night I made the written record of the action taken. May 23rd. Prior to noon, I performed baptisms, christening the smaller children and infants whom the newly christened parents willingly brought forth to be christened. I had also anointed with myrrh, chrismated the family of a Kolchani, a wife and daughter, who were baptized in 1846 by Simeon Lukin. A total of souls who joined the Church of Christ today is 36. Beside them, I baptized an infant born to Christians during the past year. This concluded the act of baptism. Everyone became christened, with the exception of 2 women whom it was impossible to baptize. Afterwards, I started on written business and continued to be busy with it the entire day. May 24th. Since morning, I was again busy with written matters, as it was necessary, besides this record, to write out many certificates for all those who were newly christened. As it was Sunday, I held a service to God and in the open field. All those newly christened, all that are here present, attended and prayed. One must imagine the joy in my heart of so many souls gathered in one place. There were more than 300, praying to God, people of various nations, formerly living in strife with each other, enemies now united as Christ's church flock, offering prayers to the true God. After the service, I offered them a sermon as to the reborn children, first declaring why I held such a communal prayer, and that is explaining that today is Sunday. Then I taught them the Christian law, taught about prayer, Christian love and virtues, and most of all about human kindness, the love, about peaceful and cordial coexistence of all peoples and so on. Afterwards, and when I finished writing, on my invitation once again, everyone gathered before me and I gave out certificates of baptism. Then I gave a final sermon for their instruction. Thus I finished my activity with them at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and then commenced preparations for my departure. They too began to disperse, but all of them first came to me for my blessing. I left at 5 o'clock on my return trip along the river Chagliuk. All my companions came with me, traveling with the current. We moved very fast, and by 10 o'clock at night, we arrived at the village of the Toyan, a Kantilnuk. He had not returned. Here I stopped until morning. His son Nikolai remained here. He helped me with very much yesterday during all my engagements with those who were newly converting, translating whatever I said for the Ingalit and for the Kolchani, and for this I remain grateful very so much. So I think given the time and the times and it's just pretty mind-blowing.
Amazing.
Yeah. it's also a pretty amazing thing, you know, to gather 300 people together. The way the Athabascans lived, they lived in small bands, small family groups, clans, not in large villages, not in, and they lived a semi-nomadic life. You know, part of the year they would follow the herds, and part of the year they would probably wintertime they would stay put. And so it was really really an amazing thing, you know, for all those people to come together.
Vladika,
Yeah,
bless me, it's John Swenson.
John, God bless you.
Thank you. I guess probably when he said it was impossible to baptize those two women, it was maybe that they weren't converted, or?
No, they probably were menstruating.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that we had laws of purity like that in the Old Testament. It's similar to that.
Yeah, there are.
Really?
There are.
Oh,
No,
I see.
Yeah, it's actually even in the canons, and so you'll find it's observed in different ways in different places. So yeah. So any more questions about St. Iakov?
How old did you say he was at that point, Vladika?
He was about 60.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was he a bishop or a priest?
He was a priest.
Oh.
His wife had died long before, and so it was so he was alone, and you know, did this remarkable work of evangelizing this whole area of Alaska. With the Aleuts down here, and the Yupiks up here, and the Athabascans in here.
How many priests did we have doing missionary work at that time? Do you know? Any idea?
In Alaska?
Yeah.
3 or 4, maybe.
Golly.
Yeah. And most of the Russians left or died, or you know, so it was not exactly an active thing for missionaries to be coming in. The Russians would go to a couple of the bigger centers, but would not go into wouldn't so much go out to the native villages, or at least not into the depths of Alaska at that time. You know, later on you'd have priests who would travel like that. But so, for example, this, you know, St. Iakov is so remarkable, not only because he did such an extensive missionary work, you know, working with all the major groups, because then he got sent down to Sitka, just down here someplace.
What time period are we talking about, Vladika, here?
He was sent to Sitka around 1860. So that I think he was born around 1898, I think, and came back to Atka after seminary around 1824. So this was 1853, that section that I just read.
Where was he born?
On Atka?
So was he wasn't a native, was he?
Yes.
He was a native.
He
Wow.
was half native, half Atka is out here. And St. Innocent was here.
And he was converted by St. Innocent?
No, he was, he grew up, he was his mother was Aleut and his father was Russian.
Oh.
So he grew up in the church and then went to seminary, was sent to Russia, and then came back to minister to his own people in this parish. Looks like a nice neighborhood, you know, if you can imagine. Then got sent to, after his wife died, then he got sent to what became Russian mission on the Yukon River, to the Yupiks, went to the Athabascans, and then to the Tlinkits. So, certainly one of the greatest of the missionaries whoever served in North America, and a native. Now we need to switch gears a bit. I want to talk about what happened later. What in Alaska with you had the sale of Alaska, of course, to the Americans in 1867. Sitka had been the provincial or the colonial capital for the Russians. It's interesting, eventually the Americans moved it, the capital, to Juneau, which is somewhere in here. Where's Juneau? Here. Which is, I guess it's actually on the mainland. Very close. We have a couple of number of documents from the time that time in Alaska between 1867 and then by the time it officially became a territory. It was just it actually was being more supervised by commercial companies for a while before it even had any kind of state identity, other than that it was territory that belonged to the United States. In the meantime, the Russian churches and the schools that they ran, the orphanages and the pastoral school, which was in Sitka, continued to operate. Even as far as 1900, there were schools all over Alaska that continued to serve the native population. Those schools taught Russian. They probably taught English by that time. But they also taught the children in their native languages and to read and to write according to the texts that and the systems that were created by St. Innocent and by his successors to be able to read and write the Aleutic and Tlingit languages, and probably also Athabaskan. I'm not sure who worked on that. The Russian policy had basically been to respect the natives as far as possible. You know, some of them did more so than the others, but for the most part, the native villages were left intact. They might have a church put in them, which the natives themselves would most likely build, but it wasn't a hostile presence. It wasn't some kind of hostile takeover. The Russians would employ the native peoples in, for their hunting and other stuff, and would in turn pay them and treat them more or less decently, and they certainly were regarded as human beings. Now, the Spanish down the coast did not regard the natives as human beings, and simply used them as slave labor. And although they did baptize them, they often just killed them. So it was, there's quite a contrast between the Spanish conquest of California and the Russian presence in Alaska, which remained primarily commercial.
Vladika,
yeah.
I have a quick question. If the Spanish did not regard the natives as human beings, how could they baptize them? I mean, does the Catholic Church allow baptizing non-humans?
No, the Catholic Church does not. I don't know how they justified it. That was the attitude at first. Eventually, the Vatican did, or the Catholic Church did, declare them to be human, so that there was no problem along those lines. But they were still bitterly abused. It's a pretty sorry history. Now, the other thing too about this is that the missionaries continued to evangelize the native missionaries, some of whom had been trained in the pastoral school in Sitka, continued to missionize all these areas and all of these peoples that had not heard the gospel, and they established the Orthodox Church there. One of the big institutions that is actually still a kind of power to be contended with in Alaska are the readers. And if a man became a reader in the church, that meant that he would that he had a lot of authority in the eyes of the church and in the eyes of the people. So he became like I won't say a second chief, but he became the major religious leader in the community. He would lead the services when there was no priest there, and obviously there were not a lot of priests in Alaska up until actually the past 25, 30 years. So the priests would come in once a year if a village was lucky. And so it was up to the reader in the parish to do the service, probably to bury people, probably to baptize people. So quite an active ministry, and certainly to catechize as far as possible. Now, one of the things that happened, which when the United States took over Alaska, is that it was flooded with Protestant missionaries. And one of these missionaries was a Presbyterian by the name of Sheldon Jackson. And he had previous missionary experience with Indians in both in Georgia and in the Cherokee in Georgia, and then in Oklahoma after the Trail of Tears. And then he came up to Alaska to bring his Presbyterian sect with him. And he was also very instrumental in the establishment of schools for the children. Now, of course, the Orthodox churches already had schools, were already teaching, and they were teaching the children not only in Russian, probably English, but also their native language. And they were local schools in the parish, in the churches that were already established in the villages. With Sheldon Jackson, there came a whole program that there were a few schools, such as one here in Wrangell, right here, not too far from, relatively speaking, Sitka over here, the capital, and a couple of others. There was one out in Unalaska that were boarding schools. And like many other places in the United States, the children were forcibly removed from their villages and put into the boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native language, and they were forbidden to practice their Orthodox faith. In many places, the children were, even though there were churches, in fact, there's a letter in this book, Alaskan Missionary Spirituality. There's a letter or correspondence in this book between the priest at the church in Unalaska and the headmistress of one of the schools, which over a sad incident that one of the children died. The priest was not informed that she was sick, neither was he informed that she had died, and neither was he informed that they were going to bury her in the church cemetery with Protestant, according to the Protestant rites. They had essentially made her a Protestant and forced her to abandon her Orthodox faith. A lot of this missionization, and you had 4 or 5 major groups doing this. You had the Presbyterians with Sheldon Jackson, you had the Episcopalians, you had the Moravians, which is a little tiny denomination, and then you had the Catholics. And they did their best to destroy Orthodoxy among the natives and to destroy the native cultures. They were very successful among the Aleuts and the Athabascans. The Yupiks remained very faithful, and the Tlingits did their very best to try and repel the Americans. Eventually, they came to cooperate, but they too ultimately suffered very greatly from this system, which really created a tremendous abuse of the children, and many of the children indeed were both physically and sexually abused in these schools, and it was a categorical disaster. The same policy was used throughout Native America, so under the label of, or under the justification of Americanization, a lot of this kind of abuse was carried out. It wasn't until, I believe, about the 1960s when the government essentially was forced to build schools in the villages and to stop messing with the local culture. The schools now in Alaska are major institutions in the villages, but they no longer try and destroy the culture.
Ladika?
Yeah.
How did they claim authority to do that? To take children away from their own villages?
Well, they actually lied to the parents. They said it would be good for the children because they would learn how to speak English, and that would allow them to do well in the future. And they promised them that they would be able to preserve their native identity.
Mm.
So it was all on the basis of lies.
Mm.
Probably money as well.
I don't believe they paid the parents to let their children go.
They might have given scholarships though for the children.
So called, yeah.
And then if a lot of people that are desperately poor, if the children live somewhere else, they don't have to pay for their clothes and food, however. So that ends up throwing a lot of people into foster care or other situations like this.
Yeah.
This attitude is not, in Russian history, is not limited to just Alaska. The Russians have this thing that's lasted for hundreds of years about being an imperial power, but not being an imperialistic power, by which they mean they absorb and respect other cultures.
Yes.
And this was certainly not the case with American Indian culture and many other things. It's completely diametrically opposite, this idea of stomping out destroying all these local cultures.
Well, one of the things that it provides an interesting, I won't say contrast, is what happened here in Alaska with the Native Americans at the hands of the Americans, and what happened in the next chapter that we're going to cover, which is St. Alexis Toth. So anyway, does anybody have any other points regarding the church in Alaska? There was just a little bit of more 20th century history. There was a priest. There were a whole variety of priests who went through there. Some of them honorable, some of them not so honorable. And one of them there was a monk priest monk, who decided to settle on Spruce Island and continue the legacy of St. Herman's habitation there. His name is Father Gerasim Schmaltz. And he built a little cabin, and he lived there for many years, actually. He also, I believe he may have actually built the little chapel that is over St. Herman's grave. It wasn't until 1970 when the OCA took over, received its autocephaly, and then took over Alaska, that there was the canonization of St. Herman. Although actually the canonization of St. Herman happened just before the autocephaly of the OCA. Autocephaly, I think. Anyway, the canonization of St. Herman was actually one of the last events that the OCA and ROCOR did together. More or less together. They did them separately, but at the same time. And when St. Herman was canonized, they were still in communion with one another, which didn't last until the end of the year. So Father Gerasim lived on Spruce Island, and he actually exhumed the relics of St. Herman when the time came for him to be canonized. According to the story, St. Herman was incorrupt, but Father Gerasim had been Athonite, and it was the practice of the Athonites when there was still flesh on the bones, that the bones would be cleaned. So evidently he kind of made St. Herman soup.
Ew.
and boiled the bones so that they became nice and clean. And those St. Herman's bones are in Kodiak in the cathedral there. He did not remain in his beloved Spruce Island. So with that, and that is pretty gross, pretty awful. With that, we're going to switch gears here from the far west to, well, you could call it the Middle East, and Father Alexis Toth. Now, that passage about St. Alexis Toth, or that passage about St Iakov Netsvetov going to the Athabascans happened in the year 1853. Father Alexis Toth was born in the year 1853 in Slovakia. And he was called to Minneapolis. He became a priest. He was a married priest in the Greek Catholic Church. And his wife died early. He became chancellor of the diocese, and he was the chancellor and the professor at the major Greek Catholic seminary in Prešov in Slovakia. During this period, there was a rather large immigration of people to from that area, from Carpatho Russia and Slovakia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to the United States, and many of them settled where the coal mines were in Pennsylvania, and where the steel industry was in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, all the whole Rust Belt, all along here, Chicago, and then up in Minneapolis. And in Minneapolis, there was a huge community of Greek Catholics who formed a church called St. Mary's. And St. Mary's has, for most of its history, been the largest church in the OCA, with like 1,200 families. Big, it's a big church. It started out as Greek Catholic, and that was because for their first priest, when they called Father Alexis Toth to come over from Slovakia, he came over, started his work at the church, and then decided to go and to visit the only bishop that made any sense, which was the Latin Roman Catholic bishop. Well, at the time, that bishop was an Irishman by the name of John Ireland, but one of his big things in his ministry was a movement called Americanization and Americanism. And so this is around 1890, thereabouts. And, and Americanism was basically an attitude towards immigrants that wanted to thoroughly integrate the immigrants into American society and culture. Of course, at this time, the immigrants were simply other Europeans. There were no other major groups of immigrants yet at this time. And so, of course, the major group was Germans, but there were some Italians and now these Slavs and others who were coming in. And of course, many of them were Roman Catholic. And so John Ireland made it a priority in his ministry to Americanize these immigrants and to make sure that they didn't look, feel, or smell like immigrants or sound like immigrants. So you can only imagine when a very large, dignified, bearded Carpatho-Russian priest who had been married presented himself, archpriest, a senior archpriest actually, presented himself before the bishop and started telling him about this parish that there was there in his city, and he asked for a blessing to serve that parish there, because obviously in the Catholic Church, just like the Orthodox Church, you don't do anything without a blessing. Well, Bishop Ireland instead started to argue, and he argued and said, we don't need immigrants, we don't need all these strange people, and we certainly don't need people like you who you're not even a real Catholic. And so it goes on, and evidently things got rather heated. And so Ireland basically threw him out. He forbade him to serve the liturgy, and he also forbade him to have anything, he also forbade all of his clergy to have anything to do with this community of Slovak immigrants. So after he went back and reported this to the parish council, and there were a number of other Uniate clergy there, in the area that he was in touch with. And so they decided to go and to present their case to the Russian bishop in San Francisco. And so they went to San Francisco and presented the case to Bishop Vladimir Sokolovsky, who was nearing the end of his tenure in San Francisco. They decided eventually to transition from being Greek Catholics into the Russian Orthodox Church. This began a huge movement. Saint Alexis is credited with the conversion of about 163 parishes personally, from the Uniates to Orthodoxy. Eventually, the movement turned into about 300 parishes, all of which joined the Russian mission, and quickly formed the largest part of the Russian mission. He brought probably 100,000 people out of Uniatism into the Orthodox Church. He became one of the a close advisor and to the bishops, and at that when he between the time that he went to see him and the time that he went back to convert, Bishop Vladimir had been replaced by a Bishop Nicholas, who was also a remarkable person in expanding the mission of the church. He was received in 1892, and then went back to Minneapolis and received 361 people, which was that parish in Minneapolis. And then the movement spread from there. This was probably one of the most significant movements that got the Russian Orthodox Church established in America. By this time, there were already several hundred churches, besides a couple hundred churches besides this group, especially if you include all the various churches in Alaska. Of course, Alaska was still not a state by that time. The diocese had relocated from Sitka down to San Francisco in 1872. The parish in San Francisco had been operating on and off for a number of years, but was already a substantial church by the time it was declared the diocesan cathedral for North America. And it was already serving in English, and they were already teaching and preaching in English. And as I'd mentioned, this was also the home for Father Sebastian Dabovich, who was born and raised in that community, who became the first American-born priest, who then also consolidated the Serbian communities into parishes. Of course, all under the Russian Orthodox Church. So most of that Uniate presence remained in this kind of Rust Belt here. little bit in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, otherwise known as Panslavia, where there were scores of churches. The Detroit area, Chicago area, and then Minneapolis. Maybe you could probably take it up to Milwaukee as well. This really formed the foundation of Orthodoxy in America. Now, somewhere in this book, it's a very interesting book. Get out of the screen share mode. Okay. There we go. This book is The Quest for Orthodox Church Unity in America by Archimandrite Seraphim. It was a doctoral dissertation from Moscow Theological Academy, and it was published in 1973. I have no idea who the Archimandrite Seraphim was who wrote it. But there was I can't hear you. Is somebody saying something? Anyway, I can't find the table. I'll have a table for you with the information as to the number of churches that existed at these various times. Coinciding with this movement into the Russian Church of these Uniates was the arrival of St. Tikhon. St. Tikhon, and he deserves at least a whole evening to himself. So I'm not going to go into St. Tikhon too much. But St. Tikhon arrived in 1898. He was a young bishop, fairly newly minted. He took up residence in San Francisco, and then traveled throughout the entire country. He visited parishes, he consecrated churches, and really came to know his diocese. But we'll deal more with him next week. So any questions, any comments about any of this?
I get a question.
Sure.
You mentioned the doctoral dissertation on the unity, quest for unity, but you didn't give any other commentary about it. I mean, what's the significance of that particular document is what?
Basically, it's a book that was published that it's the kind of a comprehensive study of the Orthodox Church and its history on a broad kind of with a broad spectrum, looking at all of the various jurisdictions and the movement towards Orthodox unity. Of course, one of the things that's that's a major theme throughout the whole history of the church is this unity and diversity. Now, even in Alaska, you had 4 major ethnic groups that became Orthodox. You had the Aleuts, you had the Tlinkits, you had the Athabascans, and you had the Yupiks, all of whom spoke totally different languages, all of whom had totally different cultures, and historically did not exactly get along. Of course, they didn't necessarily have a whole lot of contact either. When we move down to considering the United States proper, at least the lower 48, the history is that after the Civil War, there were waves of immigrants. Then there were then later on in the 20th century, especially after the First World War, the Second World War, and still after that, up through the 90s, and now, of course, there were these huge waves of immigrants that came in. Part of that wave was early on, there were Greeks and there were Serbs, many of whom came for the gold rush in California. The Serbs especially, who were into mining, the Greeks also, and then several other groups. You also had an influx of Lebanese and Syrians, and not too many, and then there was, then there were a few Russians, not many, but the Russians provided the churches and the clergy, and actually the Russian government, St. Innocent's Missionary Society, provided a lot of the funding for the church in North America. The czars built the churches, some of the churches anyway. Church in San Francisco, the old church in San Francisco, and then throughout New York and Connecticut and other urban areas, you have these churches which are actually donated by the czar. Not that there were any Russians there. There were in San Francisco and maybe in New York, but otherwise, and a few in Alaska, but otherwise, there was no substantial Russian immigration into the United States until after the First World War. But you had, especially, in the starting in the 1880s, with the industrialization, there was a strong wave of immigration, and that continued, mostly Europeans. That included also a lot of Greeks. Now the Greeks were not as integrated under the Russian Church as the rest of the Orthodox. The Arabs had a long history of cooperating with the Russians, especially the Syrians, who, because the Russian Church had assisted them to get rid of a Greek patriarch in Damascus, so that they could have an Arab patriarch who spoke their own language and they could identify with. The Serbs also have long had a very close relationship with the Russians. But the Greeks were kind of doing their own thing. The first actual parishes that were established in the States were in New Orleans about 1860, San Francisco, early 1860s at some point. And then then they started popping up later on throughout the country in various places, wherever there were groups of Orthodox immigrants. And a lot of the parishes started out as multi-ethnic. It's only later that you have the disintegration of that initial unity. You know, it really, in a sense, it really doesn't matter that the first presence of Orthodox in America was in Williamsburg with the Anglican converts, Ludwell and family, or the Greeks in Florida, because they didn't those were not canonically established churches and canonically established jurisdiction. The Russians had canonically established an episcopal jurisdiction in North America with the advent. They tried in 1799, but then it finally came together in 1842 when St. Innocent was sent back as bishop. That, of course, that was a see within the Russian Empire at that time. Later on, the canonically established see for North America for all Orthodox was the Russian Church in San Francisco with the Russian bishop, and there were no other Orthodox bishops at the time in North America. Everybody looked to the one bishop. Later on, everything would fragment, and so it turned into this same kind of debacle of which we're trying to figure out now, of how to create a unity out of with all of this diversity.
That's a thorny issue now, isn't it, Ladika, in some ways?
Well, it's a very complicated issue, you know, because it's not just ethnic diversity. Right now, you have this whole issue going on with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who actually claims to be the sole canonical authority for North America, and he says that the Russian establishment was not really legitimate because they didn't have his authority to do it. Now, the Patriarch, this whole doctrine of Constantinople having jurisdiction over all of the so-called diaspora, that only comes with Meletios Metexakis in 1923, and the Russian mission was in 1794. So, you know,
Was he a Mason, Meletios Metexakis, or whatever his name was?
oh yeah,
He was a Mason, wasn't he?
big time.
Wasn't he Patriarch of more than one see, or something like that?
Yeah, he became Patriarch of Constantinople, got kicked out, but that was normal at that time, and then he ended up in Alexandria. But we'll get into Meletios Metexakis later on. One of the very interesting things about this whole history is, you know, these various visions that of unity that were of Orthodox unity that were put forth by various people. St. Tikhon was a major figure in doing that, and of course his ministry here was well, it was 8 years, or about 8 years, 9 years. And so he didn't have a chance to bring to fulfillment what he hoped for, but he created a structure which he thought could work towards creating a united church in North America.
when we talk more about Meletius, what is his last name?
Menexakis?
Meletiakis.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how a major, as you said, Mason got so high in the church.
Masonry is one thing in Western Europe and America. It's something totally different in the Middle East.
Right.
It's something very much accepted in the Middle Eastern churches. So it's not. It's the Russian church, has no patience with Masonry. But the Greek churches and the Middle Eastern churches in general are full of Masons.
Well, we all know about the concerns that exiled Russian Orthodox had during the Soviet era with the patriarchs and Soviet times in Russia. But there seems to be, I've detected over the years going to Greece, a lot of suspicion that the same sort of political influences were brought to bear on the patriarch in Constantinople, a sort of equivalent to what the Soviets did with some of the patriarchs in Moscow. So,
well, yeah.
The Greeks were the first ones I ever heard complain about the political influence of the Turks and on the church and that sort of thing.
Well, you've got the political influence of the Turks, and since 1948, you have the political influence of the United States.
Yes.
And
you see that in this Ukrainian controversy.
Oh yeah, but it's been going since 1948.
Well, Ukraine has been part of the Russian church for 2 or 3 centuries.
No, the Ukraine has always been part of Russia. It's yeah. I mean, Russia comes out of Ukraine.
So the church has never been autonomous. It's always been part of the Russian church.
Well, yeah. Actually, the Russian church was part of the Church of Kiev.
Yeah. That goes back to the Middle Ages, I guess.
Well, it goes back. Yeah, it goes back. Well, it goes back all the way to the foundation of the Russian Church.
Yeah.
The Kievan Metropolitanate was always the mother see in Russia of the Russian Church up until, well, it all got messed up with the whole Uniate thing, and then the see was transferred. The primatial see was transferred to Moscow, and Kiev became a kind of dependency on Moscow. In other words, it became an autonomous part of the Russian church. So we'll go into that whole thing. It's a very complicated issue. And it's sadly, I think, going to have a huge effect on the church in America.
Does the Patriarch of Constantinople, does he claim almost like immediate and universal jurisdiction almost, or what is he?
It's not quite the same formula as the papacy. I don't think he would claim personal jurisdiction over every Orthodox Christian, like the Pope claims personal immediate jurisdiction over every Roman Catholic.
Right.
But he certainly proclaims authority over all local synods.
Which would include all the autocephalous churches?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and none of the autocephalous churches are really willing to cede that. But we can talk about that at a different time. So do we have any other questions? All right. Well, so shall we pray? It is truly me to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever into ages of ages.
Ispalati despota.
God bless you.